1,200 rounds per minute. That was the fire rate of the Maschinengewehr 42. Soldiers called it Hitler's Buzzsaw. The sound was not a series of shots, but the ripping of industrial fabric. This weapon changed the geography of the European battlefield from 1942 until the end of the war. Why did this machine gun become a symbol of terror? It seemed like a simple tool of steel and wood, but the engineering behind it created a level of lethality previously unseen in infantry combat. At first glance, a standard squad support weapon, but in reality, a portable meat grinder. The German army built its entire tactical doctrine around this single barrel. It was not an accessory to the rifleman. The rifleman existed only to protect the gun. They carried the ammunition, changed the glowing red barrels, and scouted targets. The footage shows a three-man crew moving with mechanical precision. One gunner, two assistants. They functioned as a single organism. Events accelerated. On the Eastern Front, the weapon reached its breaking point. Allied soldiers learned to fear the silence between bursts. That silence meant a barrel change. It lasted 7 seconds. If you didn't move in those 7 seconds, you died. The sound of a bolt racking was the final warning. But the physical destruction was only half the story. The psychological toll on the operators was absolute. Imagine pulling a trigger and watching an entire company of men disappear in a cloud of dust and blood. There are reports of gunners suffering complete mental collapses after a single engagement. They saw the human body shredded by high-velocity Mauser rounds. There was no mistake. The weapon was too efficient. It turned soldiers into executioners. The archives contain accounts of men refusing to eat or speak after a defensive stand. They stared at their hands. They heard the buzzing in their sleep. It wasn't just a machine gun. It was a psychological weight that crushed both the target and the shooter. The facts remain. Thus began the era of modern suppression, 1918. The Great War ended, and the nature of combat changed forever. Germany abandoned static trench warfare for the Blitzkrieg. Speed became the primary requirement. They needed a weapon that could keep pace with fast-moving tanks and infantry. The old MG-08 was a relic. It used a bulky, water-cooled jacket and weighed 88 pounds. Moving it required a team of men. In 1930, German engineers pivoted to air-cooled systems. They produced the MG-13. It was lighter, but it had a fatal flaw. The weapon used a 25-round magazine. At full auto, the magazine emptied in just 2.5 seconds. The soldiers spent more time reloading than shooting. 1934. The iconic MG-34 arrived. It was the first true general-purpose machine gun. It used belt-fed ammunition and featured a revolutionary quick-change barrel system. The firing rate hit 900 rounds per minute. It was effective on the battlefield. It was reliable in the mud. But there was a problem. The MG-34 was a masterpiece of over-engineering. It was expensive. It was slow to build. Each unit required 150 man-hours of precision machining. As the war expanded, the factories could not keep up. The military issued a new challenge. They demanded a weapon that was cheap, easy to mass-produce, and terrifying. The specifications required a firing rate between 20 and 25 rounds every single second. The result surprised everyone. Engineers moved away from milled steel and turned to stamped metal parts. This change cut production time in half. Only 75 man-hours were needed to build one. Costs plummeted. This was the birth of the MG-42. The footage shows the weapon in action, a blur of motion. It was more durable than its predecessor. The barrel change system was faster and simpler. Most importantly, it fired 1,200 rounds per minute. This was more than double the rate of standard Allied machine guns. The sound was unique. It didn't pop, it growled like a buzzsaw. At first glance, it looked like a budget solution. But in reality, it was one of the most successful designs in military history. With only minor adjustments, the design remains in service today. The MG-42 set the standard for modern fire support. The era of the high-speed machine gun had begun. 423,000 units. That is how many MG-42s the German industry produced in just 3 years. It surpassed every other Allied machine gun in raw speed. But the weapon had a flaw. Engineers called it bolt bounce. The metal bolt would rebound off the barrel, causing the mechanism to jam or explode. These were catastrophic failures. In the heat of battle, a jammed gun meant death. Despite the technical risks, the MG-42 became the primary tool for killing on the Eastern and Western fronts. American soldiers were famous for giving nicknames to everything on the battlefield. They called the German multi-barrel rocket launcher the Screaming Mimi. They called the Model 24 grenade the Potato Masher. They called the S-mine the Bouncing Betty. But for this weapon, they chose something more ominous. They called it the Buzzsaw, or more specifically, Hitler's Buzzsaw. The name was a translation. At first, German troops called the weapon the Bone Saw. American G has simply modified the phrase. Why did they use this name? The sound was the reason. The MG-42 did not fire individual shots. It produced a continuous, mechanical roar. The US military was worried. To stop the panic, they produced propaganda films for new recruits. These movies attempted to downgrade the weapon's reputation. The narrator in the film compared it to American machine guns and claimed the MG-42 was inferior. The script said its bark was worse than its bite. Veterans who had actually faced the weapon didn't buy it. They knew the reality of the front line. How did the Germans use it? It was not just a support weapon. The MG-42 was the most important component of the German infantry squad. It was the primary source of firepower. A standard squad consisted of 10 men. This included a squad leader and a second in command. Then came the three-man machine gun team, the gunner, the assistant gunner, and the ammunition carrier. Finally, there were 5 riflemen. The MG-42 was the backbone of the entire unit. Every man in the squad had one job: ensure the gun kept firing. They organized their movement, their protection, and their logistics around this single weapon. The gunner held the highest responsibility. The military designated him as Schütze 1. He carried the weapon, fired the bursts, and performed all field maintenance. In any combat formation, he stayed at the center. The footage shows the reality. When the MG-42 opened fire, the squad moved forward. Without the gun, the squad was powerless. This was the core of German infantry tactics. One machine gun, one sidearm, 50 rounds of ammunition in a single drum. This was the load of the primary gunner. He stood at the center of the squad's firepower. To his left or rear sat the assistant gunner. This soldier carried 4 extra drums and 1 heavy ammunition box containing 300 rounds. He also carried a pistol for close-range defense. The assistant gunner had specific physical tasks. He fed the belts. He cleared mechanical jams. He swapped out overheating barrels and reloaded the weapon under fire. If the gunner fell, the assistant took his place immediately. Further back stood the ammunition carrier. He carried 2 more boxes, each holding 300 rounds. His only weapon was a shortened Kar 98K rifle. He was the squad's mobile warehouse. The riflemen formed the rest of the line. Each man carried a Kar 98K rifle, 45 standard rounds, and a bayonet. In reality, they stuffed their pockets with extra ammunition before every engagement. These men were the primary force for offensive charges. They moved forward while the machine gun pinned the enemy down. But who held them together? The squad leader. He carried an MP-40 submachine gun and 6 magazines with 32 rounds each. He did not fire often. Instead, he watched the battlefield. He pointed out targets for the gunner and coordinated the movements of the riflemen. The squad carried at least 1,800 rounds of 7.92 by 57 mm ammunition. These heavy bullets worked in both the machine guns and the rifles. They also hauled hand grenades and a heavy tripod carried like a backpack. There was no room for error. If the leader died, the second in command took over. His job was to manage the squad and maintain a radio or messenger link to the platoon headquarters. The hierarchy was rigid. Every man knew his weight, his weapon, and his replacement. The system was built for endurance. Thus, the squad functioned as a single machine. 1942. The Wehrmacht deployed a weapon that changed the infantry landscape. The MG-42 was not just a gun. It was a modular killing system. Why was it so feared? It was adaptable. but adaptability required extreme physical stamina. The weapon functioned in two primary modes. In the light role, a standard 10-man squad carried one machine gun on a bipod. In heavy defensive roles, commanders combined 2 or 4 squads. This created a concentrated wall of lead. Moving the equipment was a logistical struggle. Soldiers used horses and heavy wagons to transport thousands of rounds of belted ammunition. Physicality was a requirement. The recoil was violent. The vibration shook the operator's entire body. Firing while moving was nearly impossible for an average soldier. Only the strongest men could keep the barrel level during an advance. How did the crews master this beast? The manual was strict, but the reality of combat was chaotic. Training focused on trigger discipline. Instructors demanded short, controlled bursts of 5 to 7 rounds. This prevented the gun from climbing and saved ammunition. During heavy contact, a fresh barrel lasted only 20 seconds. After 250 rounds, the metal began to glow red. Heat waves distorted the shooter's vision. The footage shows the process. The gunner stops. The assistant gunner reaches for the side latch. He flips the lever and the hot barrel slides out. He grabs a cold barrel from a protective carrier and snaps it into place. A veteran crew performed this in under 10 seconds. They rotated 3 or 4 barrels to prevent the steel from warping. Allied infantry watched for this pause. They listened for the silence. That 10-second window was the only time they could stand up and run toward the German lines. The bipod provided mobility. It allowed a soldier to drop into the dirt and open fire in seconds. This was the preferred setup for offensive strikes. In contrast, the tripod was a stationary beast. It weighed 20 kilograms. It was designed for fixed defensive lines. The tripod transformed the weapon. It featured precision optics for indirect fire. This allowed crews to hit targets they couldn't even see. It functioned like a light artillery piece. A mechanical dial controlled a sweeping motion. The gun moved automatically left to right. It covered a wide sector with surgical accuracy. The MG-42 did not stay on the ground. Mechanics bolted it onto sidecars, half-tracks, and tank turrets. It became the universal standard for the German military. The barrel cooled. The latch clicked. The firing resumed. 1,200 rounds per minute. The MG-42 was mounted on half-tracks, tanks, and motorcycles with sidecars. It functioned as a mobile fortress. Against low-flying planes, it was a wall of lead. During daylight drops, paratroopers were shot down before their chutes fully opened. Why was the MG-42 a death sentence for its own crew? The weapon was too effective. It didn't just kill, it erased entire platoons. But this power came with a price. At first glance, a supreme advantage. But in reality, a massive target on your back. Enemy snipers looked for the distinctive muzzle flash. Tank commanders ordered high-explosive shells into any window showing a barrel. Artillery focused on the MG-42 nests first. To the enemy, the crew wasn't just another unit. They were the primary threat that had to be eliminated immediately. Surrender was rarely an option. If you mowed down a wave of soldiers, their surviving comrades were not interested in taking prisoners. The rage was personal. The sound was the biggest problem. It didn't sound like a machine gun. It sounded like tearing linoleum. After 3 seconds of firing, every soldier within a mile knew exactly where the gun was located. To survive, crews had to pick up the tripod, grab the spare barrels, and run to a new position. But this wasn't always possible. In defensive lines, the orders were to hold the ground. There was no running. There was only firing until the position was overrun. Consequently, casualty rates for gunners and assistants remained among the highest in the German army. It got worse. The barrels overheated after just 200 rounds. The crew had to swap them out with asbestos gloves while under fire. One mistake meant a jammed weapon and certain death. There was no room for error. How did these weapons end up in America? Private First Class Leonard Lineski provides one answer. He was driving a truck through a secured sector in Belgium. He saw an object in the dirt. He stopped the vehicle against regulations. It was an abandoned MG-42. Lineski had a problem. He didn't know how the weapon worked. He found a German prisoner who spoke English. The price for a technical lesson was 2 packs of cigarettes. The prisoner taught him how to field strip the weapon and reassemble the bolt. Lineski disassembled the gun into small parts. He mailed the components home one by one in small packages. The weapon remained hidden in his family home for decades. In 2016, his son finally donated the machine gun to a museum. Tactics against the MG-42 were simple. You never charged across open ground. You never ran directly at the nest. You waited for the barrel change. The story of the bone saw ended with the war. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach became a killing field. On this day, the world saw the true power of the MG-42. Heinrich Severloh stood in a concrete bunker. He was a German soldier assigned to a defensive position. He did not move for hours. Severloh fired approximately 13,000 rounds from his machine gun. He watched as hundreds of Allied soldiers fell in the surf. In the frame, piles of spent brass casings. The sound of the high-speed bolt is deafening. But the weapon took a toll on its operators. These men saw the results of their work at close range. They watched bodies disintegrate in seconds. Many soldiers suffered complete mental breakdowns after the fighting stopped. The psychological weight was too heavy. They were haunted by the numbers. The Eastern Front was even more brutal. The Red Army used human wave tactics. Thousands of soldiers charged across open fields. The MG-42 turned these charges into massacres. The outcome was predictable. Rows of men disappeared under the rapid fire. But this was only the beginning. The weapon moved beyond the front lines. It became a tool of terror in occupied territories. German forces used the MG-42 to control crowds and crush local resistance. It was the primary weapon for retaliation strikes. In Yugoslavia, the command came down. 2,500 civilians were rounded up. They were to be shot in response to a partisan ambush on a German patrol. The footage shows a line of civilians facing the barrels. One German soldier refused. He ignored the direct order to fire on the crowd. His commander did not hesitate. The soldier was executed on the spot. The massacre continued without him. There was no mercy. But the Allies wanted the weapon for themselves. Captured MG-42s were the most prized trophies on the battlefield. Partisan groups and resistance fighters loved the gun. Its high fire rate was perfect for hit-and-run tactics. It allowed a small group to pin down a much larger force. The United States tried to copy the design. They captured several units and began reverse engineering. The result was the T-24 prototype. It looked exactly like the German original, but it failed. The American version could only reach 600 rounds per minute. It jammed constantly. The barrels overheated and warped. The project was a failure. Engineers scrapped the T-24 and went back to the Browning automatic rifle. They could not match the German mechanics. However, the design lived on. It became the blueprint for modern warfare. Today, the weapon is still in active service. It is now called the MG-3. It uses the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round. The rate of fire is now adjustable. It also inspired legendary weapons. The American M60 is a direct descendant. It combines the feed system of the MG-42 with the bolt of the FG-42. The DNA of the German Buzzsaw is everywhere. The story ends here.